All right. Welcome, everyone. Let me share my screen. Start my chat. Oh, quiz 5. Yes, you still have 2 days with quiz 5. Let me make a post on that. Let me share my screen. Oh yeah, yeah. I need to cancel quiz 5 is about Angular, and we're no longer covering Angular, so yeah, don't bother with quiz 5. It was it's supposed to be about Node.js and databases and whatnot. So yeah, so just ignore quiz 5 for now. You don't see my screen? All right. Let me make this small here. Let me hide this. Okay. One word about the assignment number 6. So you've all been working on connecting your database to, your application to the database. So that's assignment 6, and most of you have connected it, as the assignment suggests, to a local database instance of MySQL running locally, right, in localhost port 3306, I believe, and you had to configure it, put in your username, your password, and also write the URL that connects to the host server. And so since it's running locally, then if you deploy now your Java application, it's going to look for that server. So it's going to look for that database server, and so it's going to fail because it's running locally in your machine. It's not going to find a database running remotely on Heroku. So you'll need to add a database remotely, but this is not required for assignment 6. You can submit assignment 6 without connecting it to a remote server. But I do want to cover it. We do want to have it by the next assignment, that you can deploy your Java application on Heroku. So I did want to cover that. So if you head over to Heroku, well, this is my dashboard. But if you take a look at the elements, I think it's elements. Let me see. Yeah, in elements, this is kind of like a marketplace where you can add all sorts of additional tools to your application, right? So, for instance, you can add databases, whether it's relational databases and non-relational databases. You can add file and image storage, so that you can have folks upload their images or video, so you can create your own streaming video application to compete with Netflix. So you can search here for databases, for instance. If you say MySQL, MySQL, right? It comes up with several options of databases that you can use with your own. Okay, and so two that we have used before that have worked very well are JAWS DB MySQL and Clear DB MySQL. Either one would work just fine. Although you can also try out your Postgre or some of these other ones. Trevor, I haven't used Trevor IO, but I encourage you to try out different versions of MySQL. But some that the students have reported that have been successful are these over here: JAWSDB MySQL and ClearDB MySQL. So if you go to JAWSDB, it's free to use, if you keep it under a certain amount, which should be plenty for our purposes for this assignment. You'll need to install it, and you'll need to say which application you want to deploy it to, right? So for instance, I don't believe I've installed my own Java application for this assignment. Let me see. So let's see, Windows, React. Where's my Java? Open recent, and open is my Java. So okay. If you don't trust what this project, why would I not trust it? Yeah, so this is my Java application, which is being parsed, and we would deploy it to Heroku. Let's see, and so once you deploy it and you add ClearDB, right? It will give you this URL. Right? It will give you what this URL is, and this URL will be some really long name, something like US AWS yada yada yada. It's a really long the name of the computer where the database is running. It will also give you the name of the database. The name of the database will be some random name, right? That you cannot change. Right? It will create that schema for you, and that's the only schema that you can use, right, with a remote database. It will also provide you with a random generated username and a random generated password. Okay. Once you install your remote database, right, you can run your server either locally or you can run it on Heroku. And in both cases, it will connect to the remote database. Okay, it will connect to the wherever that database is running. It could be running halfway across the world. Okay, on a server that is somewhere in Eastern Europe, okay, or in China or somewhere else. Okay, but there's some restrictions. When you have a local database running on your local machine, you have control over the name of your schema. You have control over what username and password to use. But since this is a paid for or a remote server that you don't have control over, right? It will tell you what the name of the schema is, and what the username and what password to use. Okay, so yeah, I mean, you should try it out. You need to tell it what the name of your application is. Let me see if I have. Let me go and see if I have a Java dashboard. Let's see, Java. Okay, so for instance, here's a Java server. Okay, let's go in there. And so notice that this one I've added JAWSDB. See that? If you go to resources, you can add the resources right here. You can say find more add-ons, and you can search for MySQL, right? And then you can add anything from all these various MySQL providers, and it will provide it here. It will list it here, and I'm using the free version, right? Because I'm have very little data that I'm using, and when you click on it, it will take you to the administrative pages for that database, and it will tell you the name of the host. There it is. See this? This is the host. You can copy that. And I would paste it right here. Paste it right there. That's the name of the host. And see, the username and the password are random. So also this is a schema, so I copy that schema. So instead of being my, web dev blah 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 schema, it would be that one. I'm gonna paste that. And here's my username. Paste the username right there. And that other password. Okay. And then now I can deploy it, right? Because I do have a server running, and so that this now can work either deployed locally on my machine or remotely. So if I run it, let's see if this works locally. Let's see if it complains. Now the problem that this might have now is that this database it's for another server. It's not for this server. It needs to be deployed in the same yeah, this one is under web dev, Januzzi server, whereas this one was for web dev, for spring 2019 server, right? So it cannot go across domains, right? So it has to be set up for the same domain. Okay. Let's see. For P2 prototype submissions, what we need to do is to schedule a meeting with the TA to demo our prototype this week. Yes, you should start. You should be scheduling a demo with your TA to demo the prototype. Yes. Yep. All right. So yeah. So try and set up your database. Again, it's not due for assignment 6, but definitely for assignment 7. For assignment 7, by the time you submit assignment 7, you should have your Java server running remotely with its own database. Okay. For assignment 6, we're going to use the TAs are going to clone down your project, and they're going to try running it locally on their machine with connecting to a local database that they have running on their machine. Okay. Yeah. No. Let me fix the quiz. Because the one that it's listed there is Angular, so I need to change the numbering so that I can skip over that and go. And I believe the next quiz would be for databases, so that just to see that you know how to do entities and map it to one-to-many, many-to-one, and map tables and columns, things like that. So let me turn that on, and I'll make a post on Piazza. Yeah, don't worry about the quiz right now. Yeah, focus on finishing up A6. Could you share with us the tutorials about setting up a remote database at AWS? Yeah, the one that I have is about an old version of AWS. AWS has changed quite a bit recently. I mean, I'll share what I have, but it might be outdated. But yes, I will share what I have so far with AWS. Okay, let's see. So yeah, so that's what you should do for AWS A6 to connect it to a remote database. Okay. All right, let's get back to the material for this week. So this week and for the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about using a different server solution, right? We're going to be using Node.js as our middle tier server. Just like we had implemented RESTful applications using Java, right? We're going to try and do the same or something similar, but using Node.js to implement same thing, right? Implement RESTful APIs. And to practice how to do that, we're going to be implementing some endpoints, right, that expose a data model that allows us to manipulate and interact with quizzes, right? So we had started looking at this on Monday, right? We had taken a look at the APIs for the quizzes, right? And here the assignment gives you a good start at how would you go about getting started on the code. It gives you some example code, which we took the sample code and we implemented the RESTful APIs for quizzes, right? I do want to continue and focus now on the questions for those quizzes, and also focus a little bit on what the front end might look like. Okay. All right. So let's take a look at where we left off. Right. So let's see. This is the Node server that we worked on earlier this week. Let's review what we did. So first of all, we implemented, right? We implemented here on the server.js. We implemented the entry point for our middle tier, right? And it uses a very popular library called Express, right? That I encourage you all to take a look at and visit their website, right? It's at Express.js. So if you go there, I'm going to copy this. I'll put it here as a comment. It says to do review Express.js, and in here there's a lot of really good material that you should become familiar with, right? So go through their 4.x version, which is their latest current version, and here they have tons and tons of really good examples on how to use Express, right? You don't have to know all of it, obviously, but you should at least know where things are, and so that if a question comes up, that you might find some answers here. Okay, so we're going to be using the very tippy top of some of the features of Express, right? I mean, you can do an entire course on Express, and so what we're going to be using it for is for implementing RESTful APIs. Okay, and so the way we went about it was that we created separate files that we called controllers, right? That defined the RESTful API, right? Very much following the same architecture that we implemented when we were implementing the Java controllers, right? Remember, controllers are modules that their responsibility is to handle HTTP, right? They know how to handle anything that comes from a client, right? And participate in a client server architecture, right? They take the request coming from a client, can be a web client, but it could be also a phone or a mobile, right? It could be a desktop application. It could be anything that knows how to generate an HTTP request. Okay, and it knows everything about HTTP. Right? It knows that there's a request and a response. It knows that you can configure. It knows that there are things such as URLs. It knows there's things such as paths within the or variables inside of the path. It knows that you can send back JSON objects or strings or HTTP code, error codes. So the controller is responsible for handling everything that has to do with HTTP. It's an interface between two worlds, right? The HTTP world that it's all about streams, right? And and sending bits of data through a network connection, right? So that's the stream world, the HTTP world, and it converts all that into a JavaScript world, right? Of objects and arrays, right? And data types. Okay, and the interface between that is these two objects, right? Request is the conversion or the parsing of everything that is coming from the request from the client, including bodies and headers and cookies and the path and the time that the request happened, the IP address where this is coming from. So anything that is coming into our request, right? And then the response is our chance to generate, right, a response back to whoever requested this. Okay, and again, the architecture, the mental model that we have is that we are participating in this client-server architecture through the use of these two variables. Okay. Okay. All right. So that's the responsibility of the controller. The controller is not responsible for manipulating or interacting with data, right? Instead, that is the responsibility of the service. Okay. So that's why we have a separate entire file that is dedicated with the manipulation of the data, right? And in that service, right, the controller is delegating all its functions, right, that are being implemented in terms of the service. The service is responsible of knowing where to actually get the data from. Okay, so in this case, the service is retrieving an array or a collection of data, right? And then the controller is using that, right, to then fulfill the response, right? Getting the data from a service that knows how to get the service. So we also talked about the service. The service responsibility is to deal with data, right? Of knowing where to find the data, right? And to implement all the various CRUD operations. And now it's not responsible for actually storing the data, right? It's a little bit higher level than that. Okay, next week we will talk about the actual storage of that data and retrieval of that data, right? Which will be implemented by a DAO, a data access object, which will be the lowest level, right, of access to the actual database. Okay, so the service sits on top of that. So you have the controller. So the controller is talking to the interface of the HTTP. And next week we'll talk about data access objects. Data access objects are responsible for talking to the actual data. In this case, would be a database. Okay, so data access objects, again, it's an interface that is in between two worlds, right? In between the relational world, right? The non-relational world, right? Where the data is actually talking to a server, a database server, right? And implementing all the CRUD operations. The service is on top of that, right? On top of that, it's a higher level abstraction of that that decouples the rest of the application from where the data is or how is the data stored. Okay, so it might also implement business logic, right, in the service layer, and also it might understand relationships between multiple data sources, right, where quizzes and questions might be somehow related to one another. A service might know that, right, that these are somehow related to one another. Okay, so next week we'll do the data access. Right now the data access is just a file. Okay, we are just retrieving the data from a file, and so it's very simple. The implementation of the service is trivial, right? It just echoes the content of the file, and that's it. Next week it will get a little bit more interesting, as we introduce the access to a non-relational database, which will be Mongo. Okay. All right. So I just wanted to make clear that there are very well defined roles for controllers, defined roles for services, right? And next week, defined roles for data access objects. Right? That there's an architecture, there's a structure for this. Okay. Okay. So the service right now, right? We're only implementing two of the operations, which are the read-only operations, right? Of retrieving all the quizzes, retrieving a particular quiz by its ID. And next week, right, we'll talk about implementing update quiz, delete quiz, and create quiz. Okay, they're not required for this assignment. All right, excellent. So let's now focus on the questions. Let's take a look at how that would work. Okay, so first of all, we do have a questions JSON file, right, that describes the various questions for different quizzes, right? So here we had said that we had several questions, right, for quiz ID 234, right? Quiz ID 234 being one of the quizzes, right? There's 3 quizzes, quiz 1, 2, 3, 2, 3, 4, and 3, 4, 5. And these are the questions for each one of them. Okay. So what we're going to do is that we're going to implement a service that allows us to retrieve this data, right, in the form of services, right? Just like we had a quizzes service for quizzes, well, we're going to have one for questions as well. So first, let's fix this a little bit. And instead of having instead of having the quizzes and the questions, all mixed in, let's create a directory where we can put the questions in one directory and the quizzes in another directory, right? So let's do that. Let's create a directory. We'll call this quizzes, and let's move over the quizzes service and the data in there. Okay, and hopefully that will have worked. Let's create another directory for the questions. Okay, and let's put the questions under there. Okay, let me restart the server, make sure that I didn't break anything. Let's see if we do localhost 3000, and this is API quizzes. Okay, that still works. And be able to retrieve a particular quiz. There we go. Right, so what we want to implement, right, is being able to now say, right, if I know the quiz, the particular quiz, I'd like to know what the questions are. Something like questions like that, right? Right now, it's not mapped to anything. But let's work on implementing that. What might that look like? Okay, now the quizzes stand alone, right? The quizzes don't have any parent-child relationship, but right, you might want to do that. Right? It's not required, but right, one really cool feature that we might add to this is that instead of quizzes here being all by themselves, we could create a parent-child relationship between quizzes and their courses or their sections, and say, well, these quizzes are for that course, and so you might have a course ID, right? That this is course, ABC 1, 2, 3, right? And each one of these would have a different course, right? And this would be another course. Again, none of this is required, but it'd be really cool, right? That these two quizzes would be for this one course, whereas this quiz would be for a different course, right? But we don't have that, right? It's not part of the requirement. And so yeah, this too would be a one-to-many relationship. Right now, we don't have this. We don't have this, right? So for now, all the courses are going to have the same quizzes, right? The same exact quizzes. And once you provide a particular quiz, depending on the ID, we're going to show the specific questions for those quizzes. Okay. All right. So how would we go about that? Well, we would implement a service. Remember, the service is where everything starts, right? It's where we, retrieve the data, create the data, update the data, where we manipulate the data. So let's create a JavaScript here that says these are the questions service. Okay, and right, we're going to implement here all the various things that we can do with a question. We can say const create question. Okay, we want to be able to find all questions, right? We would like to be able to find a particular question, right? And so these are the most common types of operations you would want. You would like to update the question, and you would want to delete the question. Okay, and then you would export these APIs so that other folks can use this, right? You would say module.exports, and you would have these guys here, right? And update and delete. Okay, all right. Now, this would be fine if questions would be able to exist on their own, but they're not, right? Questions. Well, I guess if you think about a question, maybe like in a pool of questions where a question can exist on its own, right, and not even associated with any particular course, then yes, the create questions make sense, right? That you want to be able to create the question, it's standalone, and at some point somebody associates the question for a given course. Okay, so somebody might have to establish that relationship, right, between a question and a course, right? And maybe the same question can be used in multiple courses, right? Like, we're doing some database questions here, quizzes or exams, questions that you might find here in web dev. And the same question might appear in my database course, right? Because there's some topics that overlap. Okay, so yeah, so we could think of questions perhaps, existing on their own, but the way it's described here in the assignment, questions cannot exist on their own, right? They really exist as part of a quiz, right? Questions can exist only as part of a quiz. So in addition to maybe creating this question that allows us to create a question on its own, right? We also might want to create a question for quiz, something like that. Okay, which establishes the fact that here's a question and it's part of this quiz. Okay, well, that also kind of opens up the idea that when you retrieve questions, typically you're not going to want to retrieve all the questions, because you might have dozens, hundreds, thousands of questions. But more typically, questions will exist not on their own, but as part of a parent collection, right, of questions, right? That in that collection might be a quiz, right? So more commonly, you might have things such as define questions for a given quiz. Okay, so that probably is a more realistic operation, right, that you might want to use. Okay, anyway, so let's focus on some of these. Let's focus on this one in particular. Find questions for quiz, right? And let's leave all the other ones alone, or probably these two. Find question by D. Probably that one is also very common, very useful, right? So let's focus on these two. Let's focus on these two, and if we need to implement all the other ones, well, we'll go ahead and implement them. But let's add these quiz and comma, and then we'll need also find question for quiz. There we go. Okay. All right. So right now, where's the data? The data right now is in the form of a file, right? It's this one, question.json. Right. Next week, right, we'll talk about those questions existing in a database, right? In a non-relational database, MongoDB. Right, so let's bring in the questions, the actual questions, and we're going to require the questions. There we go. Okay. But next week we'll get the data from the database, not from the file system. Okay. All right. So this was trivial, right? Find all questions, even though it's kind of unrealistic that you would ever use this function, right? It's pretty easy. You just return the questions. That's it, right? Now, find questions for quiz, right? So presumably, this is based on some parameter. You telling me what quiz are you talking about? Okay, that you would provide as an argument here some ID, some quiz ID, and that would allow us to filter and say, oh, well, these are all the questions for that quiz, right? So we saw earlier that there were 3 questions for quiz, 2, 3, 4. There were 2 questions for 3, 4, 5, and there was 1 question for 1, 2, 3, right? So we could iterate, right, and find these quizzes, these questions, if we know what the quiz is, what the quiz ID is, right? So we could put in a we could just filter. We could just return would be what? It would iterate over all the questions, filtering, right? Only those questions whose quiz ID maps or matches the parameter here. We can say that. So this is the question, right? We're going to return the questions whose quiz ID, right, matches the quiz ID that we're passing as an argument, right? Those are the ones I want to keep. Right? Those are the ones that are going to return. Okay. And so that's filter. What about question ID, by question ID, right? Meaning you are going to give. So this is a quiz, right? This is a quiz ID, whereas this is a question ID. Okay, right. So if you give me the question ID, right, I'm just going to just find it in the array. And when I find it, I'm just going to return it to you, right? So basically, it's iterating over the questions and finding the question. Which one? Well, the question that matches the ID that I'm looking for, right? Where the question, ID matches the question ID. Right. Remember that this quiz ID is we're saying my parent quiz ID, which is this one, right here, this one, right? So I would, if I pass here 2, 3, 4, then it would be, I would find this one, that one, right, and that one. Those 3 questions is what it would be returned here by this filter. Whereas this one, I'm trying to find a specific quiz because I know its ID, meaning I'm looking for this ID here. I'm looking for either question 2, 3, 4, question 1, 2, 3, or question 4, 5, 6, or 5, 6, 7. I'm looking for that particular question because I know its ID. Okay. Anyway, so those are several implementations. Next week we'll talk about implementing all these other ones: update question, delete question. Okay. All right. So that's the service. That's the service. Now, notice that services don't care how they're being used, right? Again, their sole responsibility is to interact with the database, with the data. Sorry, not necessarily the database, right? The data. And I mean, we know that this data, we want to be able to access it from a React client, right? And so we need to create an HTTP URLs and APIs and whatnot. But notice that the service doesn't care about anything of that. Notice that nowhere in the service code do we have any mention of HTTP or request or response, right? Notice it's completely very pure, right? Agnostic on how the data is being accessed or how it's being used. And that's important, right? Each layer of your application should be very, very focused on doing only one thing and doing it very well. Okay, which is a principle, a very common principle of separation of concerns, right? The only concern for the service is to manipulate the data, right? And the only concern for the controller, right, the controller's responsibility, it only cares about, right, interacting with HTTP, right, and fulfilling those requests, right? Sending the response with data that it can find from the service. Okay. Oh, excuse me. Yeah. So we have the service for the questions. So let's look at the now what the controller might look like, right? The controller, right? So for the final questions, right? So that one's easy, right? So let's take a look at that. So for the controller, let's see. Let's create here a file. This would be question controller, right? The question controller, it wants to retrieve, either all the questions or a specific question, or given a particular quiz, retrieve those questions for that particular quiz, right? And remember, the responsibility of the controller is to answer to incoming HTTP requests that using our API, we're using the Express library, right? And the Express library, we know that we implemented it, instantiated here in the server, and as an app, we say we load the Express library, then we instantiate it, and then we share the instance of this app with the controller. See that? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to pass this same app to this new controller that we just built. That we're going to build, right? Is the question controller. We're also going to pass a reference to the app so that the controller can then use it here. Oops. All right. So what does this look like? Okay. Remember, what we're going to do is that we need to be able to, right? We're going to export from this controller, right, a function that can take as arguments an instance of Express, right? So this will be something like module exports a function that can take as argument the reference of the Express library, and here is where you listen for the incoming requests. And so what do we want to do? Well, the service is allowing retrieving all the questions. So what would that look like in REST? As a RESTful API, right? That would mean that the noun would have to be something like questions, right? So we want all the questions. So it's not like we want a specific question. So that means that we would not be providing a primary key, right? So something like this. The URL might be something like questions, right? Something like that. That would map to all the questions. Probably we would want to put API in front of it, only so that we distinguish these URLs from other URLs that are asking for HTML, CSS, JavaScript. This one's not asking for anything that is rendering in the front end, right? It's asking for raw data. Okay, so to distinguish this URL from other URLs that are, they're asking for static content, user front end, we're gonna prepend it with a token that we can all agree on. API is a very common token, but other tokens might be data or REST. Those are also very common. So anyway, so this is part of the convention, the RESTful convention, and also we want to be able to read the data. We want to retrieve the data, right? So again, part of the convention is that, right, this is a get, an HTTP get. Okay, so how do we bind this to an HTTP get? Right, we use the express API of .get, app.get, right? Registers this URL so that it listens for an incoming GET request. Make sense? Okay. So the actual fulfillment will be implemented by a function, right, that we need to implement. So, and the function may be called find all questions. Okay, which might be implemented up here. Find all questions. Okay, and if you remember, all these functions, right, that are mapped to an express get or put or post, they all participate in the client server architecture through the use of these two variables or parameters that are passed to these callback functions, right? Again, request includes everything that's coming from the client, and response allows it to fulfill that request. Okay. Now, in the request, we're giving, this URL, but I mean, we don't really need anything from the request. I mean, the only way that we got here is because we got that request, right? So we know what to do. There's nothing else we need from the request. Okay. So we can go ahead and start sending a response right away. So what is that we want to do? We want to send back all the questions which are here, and there's a function for that in the service, right? So let's import the service, right? We can say const question service. We can require, go up one, down to services, and then questions, and then question service. There we go. Okay, once we have that, we can now write our endpoint here, finding all questions. We can write it in terms of that service, right? We can grab the questions, which are all the questions, from the question service, find all questions. Okay, and we can return, we can send back the questions. All right, awesome. All right, so let's try it out. Now, to try it out, we need to make sure that we tied it to the server, and yes, we did. We tied it up to the server. So if we restart the server, and head over to this URL, right, we can now try to hit that endpoint questions. And notice that indeed it comes back with all the questions as that hard-coded array of questions in that file. Okay. All right, excellent. Let's do one more. Let's do one more. In particular, another one that we might definitely need quite a bit is this one, right? Being able to retrieve not all the questions, but questions that pertain or under the context of a particular quiz. Okay, so again, following naming conventions in RESTful naming conventions, the URL should be something like this, where you would have the first starts with API, then you definitely want the questions. That's what you're looking for, but you don't want all the questions, right? We have this one for that, right? This one does that. We want a subset of the questions under a specific context, right? So following RESTful conventions, you would put here whatever the context is, right? Now, for us, that context is a parent quiz, right? I don't want all the questions. I want the questions that belong to a specific quiz, right? And so here's where you would specify, that context. In that case, would be a quiz, right, of a given ID, right? So you would provide here, right, some parameter, right, that can change over time and give me the quiz ID. Okay. All right. So yeah. So this is again following naming convention, following RESTful naming conventions. Also, we are doing a read operation on that data source, right? So by convention, this would be tied to a HTTP GET. Okay. All right. So to actually implement this, right? There would be a function that actually implements it. So, and a proper name for this function would be something like find questions for quiz, right? So we would have here a function that would try to fulfill that request response, right? We would need to parse what the ID of the quiz is, and then see if our service has a function that allows us to find that, right? So let's parse out the quiz ID from this placeholder in the parameters of the request, right? So we would do something like request.params dot quiz ID. Okay. So now that we have the quiz ID, we can go out to the service and fetch all the questions for that particular quiz, right? Because I believe the question service has a function that allows us to find all the questions for a quiz, as long as you pass in the ID of the quiz in question, right? No pun intended, right? So this allows you to retrieve all the questions that of interest. Oops. Right, and then now we can send back those questions to whoever asked for them. Right, we can say response dot send back the questions. Okay. All right. Let's see. Let's restart the server. All right. So if we refresh, notice that it doesn't work. Oops. What's going on? Is it running? Quiz. Oh, it said quiz. So this is supposed to be plural. Quizzes. Let's restart. Refresh. There it is. Right. Notice that we provided the ID of the parent quiz 234, right? And we have now those three objects for whose parent quiz ID is 234. Or we're going to provide 1, 2, 3 and returns the single question, right, for quiz ID number 1, 2, 3. Or the last one, I think it was 3, 4, 5. I think it had only 2, right? 1 true, false, and 1 multiple choice. All right, so there we have it, right? So we now have, right, enough on the middle tier so that we can now interact from a user interface. So let's focus our discussion now on how is it that we would render this, right? Okay, so as a rendering application, we have been using React.js, right? So React.js, I believe that's our Java server. Let me stop that. Let me quit out of here. This one? Yeah, this is our React server. So let me start my React server here. Let's see. Terminal, npm start. Okay, so all right, this is a brand new clone of that repository. So I need to do an npm install. Okay, so while that is installing, let's take a look at the assignments of what are we asked to do. So for the client, this is what we are intending to implement. It's still installing. Just want to have it there so I can see. Oh, it's done. It's done. So anyway, so what we're trying to implement is as follows. So in the course lists, right, we're going to add, the capability of navigating to a component that lists all the available quizzes. So that's easy, right? That's trivial. Okay, I mean, we have an endpoint that returns all the quizzes. Right? We're just going to have to map it to a new route that displays all the quizzes. And then once we click on start, we're going to navigate to a component that can draw or render all the questions for that quiz. Right? So let's get started. Let's get started on what that might look like. So first, let's focus on implementing all the quizzes, right? So let's do npm start. Let's see. Oh, notice that React wants to run on port 3000, and Node.js also wants to run on port 3000. So I'm going to say React run on port 3001, I believe. Let's see. I forget. It chooses the port for you. There we go. Okay, this is what we left off a couple weeks ago. We have the course table, and maybe the server's down. I don't know. Let's see. Heroku and my generic server. Let me restart it. Actually, I don't really need it, right? Let's see. Oh, where'd it go? There we go. Okay, there we go. So we got courses. So anyway, so from the courses, so we're going to add here a link. Really doesn't matter where we add it, right? I'm going to add it here in the courses, but it could have just as well be anywhere here, right? Because they're all going to go to the same place, right? It's going to be a separate screen that is going to list all the quizzes. Okay, so let's do that. So let's in the React part, let's implement a brand new component. So we'll put it here under quizzes, and on the quizzes, let's create a brand new JavaScript, and we'll call it quizzes list. Okay, and we'll say add. And for now, just to get started, just for a prototype, we can just say import React, and then we'll do const quizzes list and return, and this will be div h2 quizzes. Okay, and let's export default quizzes list. Okay. All right. So, and when do we want to render this? We want to render it when we navigate to /quizzes or something like that, right? So let's declare that as a brand new route. Okay. And so let's the route might be something like route path, and this will be something like quizzes, right? And we're going to display the quizzes list. Okay, something like that, right? More realistically, right? More realistically, the quizzes would be for a given course, right? So any which way you want to do it, but I'm gonna just do it so it's a little more realistic, where you provide here the course ID, right? And then you would get the quizzes for that course, right? We don't have that, right? We just have one list of quizzes for all courses, but nevertheless, this might be a little more forward compatible, right? If we ever want to make this a little more sophisticated, so that you get a different list of quizzes, for different courses, right? So, it's a good engineering consideration, right? So now if we go to the list of courses, or the table of courses in the course row, right, we can add maybe an additional row or additional TD, maybe right here. Okay, we can add another TD. Okay, where we create a link, right? And that link, it would be maybe the quizzes for that course. And where would it go? It would go to the new route that we just created. That looks like what? Looks like courses, the ID of the course, right? And do we have the ID of the course? Well, we have the actual course, right? We have the actual course. So we say courses would be the course ID. And this is coming from Mongo, right? And then quizzes. One last thing perhaps is that let's make this exact, right? Let's make this exact. Exact equal true. Okay, so if we have quizzes, see that? So if we click on quizzes, notice that it navigates to the quizzes screen that we implemented earlier. Okay. Yeah. So what we now need to look at is how is it that we would render these quizzes right now, right? We're here in the listing all these quizzes. And so right now we have 3 quizzes, and we should be able to retrieve them using this URL, right? Here are all the quizzes. There they are. Okay, those are all the 3 quizzes with the different titles. So that's easy, right? I mean, we know how to do that. We've already done it a whole bunch of times, right? We could have a service that loads this, right? And then we copy it into a local state variable, right? On whenever we load, whenever we get started, whenever this component loads, you can go fetch that data. Okay. So, for instance, it would get all the quizzes and set quizzes, right, from a use state and initialize as an empty array, and we would load this on when the component first loads. Now I'm doing it here. I'm not going to use a service, right? I'm going to let you do that. You'll do the service, right? And I'll put them as to-dos here, right? So I'm going to say use effect, right? So when we first load, right? What do? We're going to do a fetch. We do a fetch into this URL, right? This URL right here. Let's copy that URL. So fetch that URL, and we're going to parse this, right? We're going to grab the response, and we're going to parse the JSON out of it, so that at the end of the day, we're going to end up with the quizzes, right? Which we're going to use to set our local quizzes. Okay. And I'm going to put a to-do here. To do implement this in a separate service file. Okay. So now that we have the quizzes, we could just iterate over them, right? So we could say iterate over this. We could say UL, maybe with a list group, and just iterate over this. We say quizzes dot map, and this is the quiz, and we're going to return the line item as a list group item, and this will be the quiz. Is it name? I forget. I think it's name. I guess not. It's returning 3, but it's not name. Is it title? Oh, title. Okay, so this is title. There we go. There's the title. Okay. All right, excellent. So we probably also want this to be maybe either a hyperlink so that we can navigate to the actual quiz, right? We could see the questions for those quizzes, right? Or maybe we could put maybe like a start button here in the end. I believe the assignment suggests that I guess we do both, a link or start. Okay, so maybe this might be better to be a div, and this, instead of being line items, this could be a link. This could be a link, and this hyperlink could then navigate somewhere, right? Let's see, yeah, so it's a hyperlink now, right? It's not navigating anywhere yet, right? But it could navigate maybe to a quiz renderer, right? That renders a quiz, right? And maybe the URL might be something like courses, the course ID, quizzes, and then followed by the ID of the quiz, right? And then something like, you know, questions or something, right? And that would render the questions for that quiz. Okay, right? I think that makes sense, right? So this might be something like to, right? The courses, the course ID. We don't have the course ID, do we? Well, we do have it in the params, right? In the params, notice that in our URL, we do provide it as part of the path. Right? So we should be able to parse that from the params in our quiz list, right? If we bring in use params, we can parse out the course ID from the params. Use params. Okay, so we can render it here in the URL. Then this would be quizzes followed by the ID of the specific quiz. So this quiz dot underscore ID, right? Slash questions. And spell it questions. Okay. All right, let's see. Let's go back. Let's render this. If I hover over it, right, you'll notice that down below you could see the URL being built. If I click on it, notice that indeed we got quizzes, the ID of the quiz, and then the questions, right? Which we don't, that's not mapped to any component, right? But the URL is working, right? So we need to map to that URL a component that knows how to render the questions, right, for that quiz. Okay. So yeah, now I forget how I asked you to call it. Let's see, quizzes. Oh, I do ask you to map it. I do ask you to map it. Oh, okay, I map it to quizzes, and okay, I do not put questions here. Okay, it makes sense. It makes sense. Yeah, I rather, yeah, let's not put at the end. Let's not put at the end questions. Just the idea of the questions is enough. I think that makes more sense. But so we need a component that knows how to render a particular quiz, and with the quiz ID, we can go fetch the questions of that quiz so that we can render all those questions. Yes. So, for instance, we might here we might say a single quiz, right? So this would be a quiz, right? Component, JavaScript. That basically a quiz is made up of multiple questions, right? So let's see, this might be import React, and this would be const quiz, right? That returns something like div, and this would be h2 question. I mean quiz, right? And then we export default quiz, right? So to map this, we would want to render the quiz when the route is as follows, right? Is when it's courses, course ID, quizzes, then followed by the ID of the particular quiz, right? So quiz ID, right? And we want to render the actual quiz that we just implemented, right? So that here, right? If we go back, let's go back. Now, if we click on quiz, notice that it goes to quiz. Notice that they all go to quiz, but with a different ID, which we can use this ID. Use this ID to go fetch the questions, right, for this quiz, right? So, for instance, we might say let's retrieve, in our URL. Notice that we have the course and we have the quiz ID. We can retrieve both of them, right, using use params, right, from React Router DOM, right? React Router DOM. So we can retrieve those three things: const course ID and quiz ID from params. That, and so here we can display the ID of the quiz ID. So there we go. See, quiz 23 123 123. Oops. If I go back, this is quiz 234. There it is, right? So yes, so we are retrieving those IDs. Now that we have the IDs, we can go fetch the questions for that particular quiz, right? So for instance, we might say that we want the questions. Right? So we're going to keep track of a list of questions. We're going to set questions. So use state, right? Initialize it as an empty array, and we'll need to bring that, use state and use effect. And so we can fetch the questions when we know the ID of the quiz, right? So let's put this at the beginning, and so we can use effect, right, to go fetch this, right? oops. Right, so that, on load, what do we want to do? We want to go fetch the questions. We're going to say, so for fetching the questions, remember the ID, the API is something like quizzes, 234/questions, right? So we want to use this URL, right? We want to go fetch, right? We want to go fetch this URL, but this would be the quiz ID, right? Would be the quiz ID. That, right? So obviously you would not do this here. You would to do, right? Move this to a service file, right? And so this would come back with a response. And then we, presumably these would be the actual questions, right? Which we can set and store in a local state, right? Which we can then render here, we can iterate over these, right? So this might be UL, and we would render these, right? Something like questions.map. And so this is a question, and we would render, li, the question, I don't know, ID for now. Let's see what that does. All right, there we go. So those are the IDs of the questions. But what do they have? So they have, the actual question, right? You have the title, the question, right? So this might be something like, page 3, the question title, and this might be the actual question. Right, so yeah, there we go. So JSON multiple choice. What does JSON stand for? And CSS true false, right? CSS stands for cascading style sheet. Right, so we're definitely getting data from the server. So there's the one question, 3 questions for this one, and a question for that, right? But these all need to render differently, right? So they need to render depending on the type, right? If it's a multiple choice question, it needs to render this way. If it's a true false question, it needs to render differently, like this one. All right. And also there, each one has kind of like different logic, right? Of highlighting and grading and blah, 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 right? So probably we don't want to implement it here, right? We probably want to have dedicated components for these, right? Probably we actually want a dedicated question component that we can pass the question and then decide to render it one way or the other. Right? So for instance, we might have something like a component here that is called question, the question component, that can render, depending on the type of the question, it can render one way or the other. So we might say, import React, and this would be a question component that maybe returns returns for now. Let's do something like this, the question, and maybe you can pass it the question as an argument, and so now we can render this here. This could be like that, right? We pass it the question, okay, and this exports the false question, so that here, instead of doing this, right, then here you could say the question, right, and then you pass it the question object, something like that. Okay, this still works the same way, right? It still works the same way, but at least this is now a little bit easier, right? And now you can in the question here you could have now logic such as oh, should this be a multiple choice question or this should be a true false question, right? Where you can have different versions of the question here, right? So maybe in a separate directory, I don't know, questions, right? So maybe we can move this here and refactor this a little bit. And here you can have different types of questions. You have a multiple choice question, multiple choice question, right? Something like import React const multiple choice question. That, for now, this might be multiple choice. And let's export multiple choice. And let's just copy this real quick so that we can have a true false question, right? True false. Where this is true false. This is true false. So now in the question, you can have the logic. You can have the logic and then ask yourself, right? And you can, let's move this. They all take the question as an argument, right? They all take the question as an argument, right? Both the true false and the multiple choice, right? And we can all render that. Oops. No. Okay, but now in the question, you can have the logic of saying, well, if the question type, right, is equal to, what are the different types? I forget. True, false. If it's equal to true, false, then I'm going to render the true, false question. I'm going to pass the question down. Okay. If instead the type is multiple choice, then I would render the multiple choice question, something like that. So yeah, so this one only has one choice. This one has two, right? This has a true, false, multiple choice, and true, false. And this one has a multiple choice and a true, false. Okay. Now you can focus on each one of them independently of rendering. How should it render, right? If it's a true, false question, then you display the maybe not the title. Maybe not the title. I don't know. How does it say to render? I forget. So I guess it's just the question and then true, false, right? So you get the question in big letters. So maybe H4. And then this true, false. So something like label, and then an input field that says true, something like that. And this is of type radio. Type radio, right? What is it that doesn't like radio? True, false. Why are you? So this one is true, false, something like that. Let's see how that renders. Okay, there is our true, false. And we need to make them independent, right? We need to make them right. If I go here, right, notice that I have two true, false, and notice that we need to make them all independent of each other. So we need to make these mutually exclusive, right? And the way you can make them mutually exclusive is that if they have the same name. They have the same name. So, for instance, you can say that the name here. Say, okay, don't do this, right? If you have a name and it's just some arbitrary name, and they're the same, now they're mutually exclusive, right? But careful, right? Now they're mutually exclusive, but look at this, right? They're all exclusive. See that? Right? They're all mutually exclusive because they all have the same name. We want them to be mutually exclusive amongst both of them, right? Between each other, not across multiple questions, right? So to make this, what we could do here is that if you remember, the question has something unique. Well, the question is unique somewhat, right? Although this text is not guaranteed to be unique, but we could use the ID. We could use the ID because that's unique within this question, right? And so they could be mutually exclusive. So let's try and do that, right? And say that the name here could be just the question and the ID. Right, that's mutually exclusive, in this question. So let's do that. Let's refresh. So there it is. So these are mutually exclusive, and these are mutually exclusive between the two. See that? Okay. For the multiple choice would be something similar, right? But instead of these being just two, let's go to the multiple choice. Right? Instead of just being one, right? There needs to be a whole bunch of them, right? With the choices, the multiple choices, right? And the choices are here, choices. So we're going to just iterate over them, rendering these. So instead of one, right, we're going to iterate over the choices. So question.choices, that map. And as we iterate, right, this is the choice. We're going to return one of these. Okay. And the text here is going to be the actual choice, right? I'm going to render the choice. Okay, so let's see what that does. All right, there it is. So we have, right, Java persistence, right, and the radios are mutually exclusive between them, right? And obviously, right, you can grade this by putting a grade button, and then if you click the grade button, right, you're basically going to compare what you chose against what the right answer is, right? And the right answer, if you selected the right answer, then you're good, right? You're going to show these check boxes, right? If not, you're going to highlight the correct answer, but then you're going to highlight your wrong answer in red, right? And then display here like an X. And same thing for the for this guy, right? So for instance, you can have a grade button. And now the grade button is different for, they behave differently for different ones, right? So for instance, it might help that you display the correct answer, question correct. Maybe in both cases, just for debugging, just for your own sanity, right? You can see the right answer is true, and here's the right answer. Java persistence API. So basically, you're gonna select these, and whatever you select, you're gonna compare against the right answer. So for instance, Java persistence API, if you select that one. If you select this one, you're gonna compare, and then you're gonna say, oh, is it correct or not? Okay, so you need to keep track of the answer that you selected, right? And so probably easier if we, put a breakpoint here somehow. Obviously, you're going to style this differently. Let's see. So we can say here we can maintain a state of what your answer was, what your answer is. So let's maintain that in a local state, use state, where we can keep track of your answer, right? Your answer, set answer, or maybe response. Your okay, this is the correct answer, and this is your answer, right? So this is your answer, right? So this is an array. So this would be use state. So your answer right now is going to be empty string. You haven't answered anything. Or actually, see, this is true or false. So this is true, false. Maybe this could be a default, maybe, or maybe null, I guess. I think you can, yeah. And so we're going to display your answer. Let's display your answer. Right. So as you click these, right, as you click, we're going to say, if you click this one, so on click, I'm going to say, set answer true. Okay. But if you click the other one, we're going to say set answer false. Okay, true, false. Okay, it's not displaying. I guess we need to do a JSON stringify to convert Boolean into a string that can be rendered. Okay, so there it is. So true, false. So now we can compare these two. We can compare these two whether you got it right. Okay, and then use that information either to highlight or display or whatever, a checkbox or an X, right? So for instance, here we might display icons. We might display icons, I, class, FA, S, FA, checkbox, right? There's a checkbox, or we might display a times. So either an X or a checkbox, and we will display one or the other depending on whether the correct answer is equal to your answer, right? So for instance, we might say we're going to display checkbox. Display if we're going to say if the answer, right, is equal to the correct answer, to the question dot correct answer. Correct answer. If it is, then we show the checkbox, right? Otherwise, right, if your answer, right, is not equal to the correct answer, we show the X, right? So notice that why is it not changing? So this is changing. This is changing. Is it correct? Question correct. Question correct. Answer. Why is it not displaying? True. Interesting. Well, I'm gonna leave it for you to fix it. Okay, but you get the gist, right? That you're going to display either the X or the checkbox based on whether you chose one or the other. Now, you're not going to display all the time, right? Like I'm doing. I'm displaying this all the time. In the assignment, you only display it. You only display when you grade it, right? If you haven't graded yet, you would not highlight or display anything. Only when you click on grade, will it say, you got it right, or you got it wrong, right? And highlight this either green or red. So you probably need another state variable, right? You probably need another state variable saying whether you have actually answered, or sorry, whether you want to grade it, right? So you need another state variable to remember that you have indeed graded it or not. Okay. All right. Excellent. Any questions? Yeah. So I do owe you quiz 5. Let me fix that. It's out of date, and I'll fix that and make it available, and just give you another couple of days to finish it. All right. Any questions? All right. If there are no questions, then thank you, everyone. Yes, I'll update A6 due dates. Thank you.